Welcome to our kitchen. Today we prepare a medieval soup with turnips and beef from Anonimo Toscano's manuscript, suggested by the author as a dish for servants. We start with ingredients. We need beef, turnips with their leaves, saffron and black pepper. First, we boil the beef in salted water. The cooking time changes depending on the cut. We cooked it for about 1 hour. Anonimo Toscano recommends this recipe for the servants. The presence of beef and spices may be surprising for anyone who isn't familiar with the medieval sources and considers medieval cooking, in particular for common people, poorer than it actually was. Beef, according to the physicians and the cooks, is a meat for people who make great physical efforts, not for the rich and nobles. In particular, adult bovine meat produces melancholic humors and provides better nourishment, according to Savonarola, whereas beef is a food for artisani, workers. Beef is listed among the meats for workers, also by the anonymous author of the Tractatus de Modo Preparandi et Condiendi Omnia Cibaria, a fundamental treatise written around the end of the 13th century. In this text, the author classifies the foods according to the social classes to which they are more suitable. For the workers, there are mutton, beef, salted pork, deer, peas, fava beans, and bread made with barley and rye. Then we add the turnips and greens. If you don't have the greens of the turnips at your disposal, you can use other greens from similar plants. In the original recipe, the author writes to boil the pre-cooked turnips with the meat. This is the most common cooking technique for turnips, which require a double cooking, according to the physicians and the cooks, to remove the potential harm, and most important, to cook them well to make them more digestible. We find this method described in many sources, for example Michele Savonarola's dietetic book and the Flora Dietarum. The turnips, according to these authors, must be cooked in plain water, then drained and cooked again with the meat. We didn't follow these directions because our turnips were very tender and young. However, if you use harder turnips, you should cook them in this way, adding them cooked to the meat. We cooked the turnips for about 10 minutes. Then we added the greens and cooked for another 10 minutes. The turnips we used are quite tender. Usually turnips take more than 20 minutes. And as we suggested, for several varieties of turnips, you may consider starting to cook them at the same time as the meat. Reading the sources, it appears clear that the spices were very common across all social classes. The main differences are the quantity and quality. The spices used among common people were worse and they were used in scarcer quantities than for dishes meant for the nobles and rich. To make an example, there are recipes in Anonimo Veneziano's cookbook in which the author recommends using an enormous amount of spices. In the recipe for Ambrosino, we read that for 12 people, we must use 6 capons and among the main ingredients, 3.5 pounds of spices, which is equivalent to more than 1 kilo of spices. This is a recipe for the nobles clearly, not for commoners. In the sources that describe recipes for the lower classes, we find the spices, but fewer and in less quantity. Here, for instance, there are just pepper and saffron. It is important to keep in mind that the weight of a pinch of pepper and a few stems of saffron is almost negligible and scarcely influences the final cost of the dish. Saffron is and was very expensive by weight, but we used about 0.1 grams of saffron, and you can use even less. Actually, for this dish, we spent more for a cheap ingredient like turnips than for saffron. Saffron indeed was very common in medieval and Renaissance cooking. It was cultivated in Italy since the antiquity, but also imported to meet the high demand. Savonarola writes that it seems impossible to make a good sauce without it, and Costanzo Felici in the 16th century writes that it is so popular that it is used every day in every kitchen by everyone. Pepper too was very common. Arnaldus de Villanova, in the 13th century, writes that pepper is the condiment of the people who live in the countryside, condimentum rusticorum. We find it in almost all the historical recipes, starting from ancient Rome and Greece. Meanwhile, we steep the saffron in warm water and grind the black pepper. In the past, we prepared a similar recipe with beef meant for the peasants from the Registrum Cucuine, a text in which we find several recipes for the lower classes. You find the video in the description below. On our Patreon page instead, you find the complete translation of the Registrum Cucuine, with the first part of the translation of Anonimo Veneziano and the Flora Dietarum, with other translations of historical sources and articles about ancient and medieval cooking. If you're interested in food in ancient Rome, check out our new book, Ancient Roman Cooking, available in English and Italian on Amazon. To support our work, you can purchase our merchandise or buy us a beer. When the meat and turnips are cooked through, we add the black pepper and saffron and cook for another minute. This soup is very simple but delicious. The leaves give complexity to the dish, with their flavor quite different from the tuber, which blends perfectly with the aroma of meat and spices. Even with a very small amount of saffron, the plate turns out full of flavor. A delicious wintry soup, hearty and warming. We suggest pairing it with millet or barley bread and a glass of wine. If you're interested in ancient foods and flavors, subscribe our channel and consider supporting us on Patreon.